Alexander Murphy is an assistant professor in the Department of Language, Literature, and Culture at Clark University. He earned his PhD in East Asian languages and civilization from the University of Chicago in 2022. His research focuses on modern Japan, particularly examining the interplay between sound, language, and the body across literature, media, and performance. Murphy's current book project explores the aesthetic and politics of the voice in interwar Japan at the intersection of music, poetry, and public speech. He is also a musician and translator of Japanese literature and criticism.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in for this last panel, and to the conference organizers for allowing me to join this conference virtually. My name is Alex Murphy, and yes, my paper is entitled "The Ear is a Weapon: Soundscapes of Racial Violence in Tokyo, 1923." So I wanted to start with a quote. In a 1940 essay on the topic of rumor, the philosopher Miki Kiyoshi wrote that, quote, "With rumor, there is no responsible party. That responsibility is assumed by what we call history," end quote. So in this talk, I want to recount a brief history of rumors in Japan. Specifically, I want to discuss what may be the most notorious incident involving rumors in Japan's modern history. Some of you may be anticipating. In the days following the Great Kantō Earthquake of 1923, a raft of rumors spread throughout the Tokyo area accusing ethnic Korean residents of conspiring with leftist dissidents to sow violence amidst the chaos of the quake's aftermath. These were groundless rumors, but they did prompt police and vigilante groups to take to the streets to try and apprehend these so-called unruly Koreans, or futei senjin in Japanese. But in their attempts to do so, these groups faced the problem of being unable to generally distinguish between Japanese and Korean residents based simply on visual appearance. So as one solution, they often subjected passersby to these ad hoc pronunciation tests, the idea being to identify colonial dissidents through the accent and intonation of the voice. And the result of these tests, these voice tests, and the larger path of vigilante activity was the massacre of not only thousands of Koreans, but also many Chinese and Japanese who had been misidentified. So this episode has been discussed quite extensively, but few have addressed its significance from a sonic perspective. In other words, as a pivotal crisis in modern Japan where vocal sound plays a crucial role, I think. So today I want to address this incident as an instance of sonic terror in which the weaponization of listening turned vocal sound into a site for encoding and enacting racialized violence against the colonized. But just as crucially, I also want to argue that these voice tests served a disavowed yet crucial role in the process of nation building in imperial Japan at a crucial moment of reckoning with the colonial order. Which is to say, I propose that the voice test here function to reassert the sensory and ideological boundaries of the imperial social order in a moment of crisis, and can therefore be viewed as a kind of primal scene in dividing the self-apparent national body from the voices that constituted its surplus. So again, similarly getting at how sound is operative in the construction and enactment of ideology. So to this task, we'll need to go back to before the earthquake, to the first major wave of Korean migration into the Tokyo metropole. So this first wave of migration unfolded in the years after Japan's annexation of the peninsula, where Korean workers were recruited to Japan as cheap labor during the manufacturing boom of World War I. They settled mostly in these areas, the eastern part of Tokyo. And after the war, an economic recession hit Japan, putting many out of work. But because conditions in the Korean countryside were worsening by the year, most migrants had little choice but to stay in Japan, and in turn, migration continued. At the same time, this second wave of migration between 1919 and 1922 coincided with the March 1st independence movement, 1919 in Korea, which attracted upwards of 2 million participants and prompted ruthless suppression by the Japanese military. And the Japanese government basically feared that these conditions set the stage for anti-colonial revolt among the Korean population in Tokyo or in Japan, who might, they felt, be radicalized by emergent leftist groups in cities like Tokyo and elsewhere. So this perceived prospect of treachery among Korean laborers and students found popular expression in the trope of the futei senjin, as I mentioned earlier, the so-called unruly Korean, which was a figure of unstable surplus that came, I think, to mediate public anxiety over the economic and political insecurities in the metropole. Narrowly, the term referenced Koreans suspected of anti-colonial sentiment, but it broadly indexed any suspicious actions involving Koreans. For instance, the term popped up again and again in newspapers whenever a crime or labor dispute carried any hint of Korean involvement. These are just some examples. Explosive found under fence, planted by a futei senjin, question mark, etc. Yet the difficulty in actually telling the so-called unruly Koreans apart from non-futei senjin meant that the term ultimately sanctioned surveillance of all Koreans as potential criminals, and likewise rendered ethnic Japanese susceptible to misidentification due to the relative absence of phenotypic markers that might afford visual articulations of racial difference, skin color, hair color, etc. So this meant that difference would need to be defined more broadly or through other means. And as you might guess, sound offered a clear avenue for this, the vocalization of language in particular. Indeed, the rate of Japanese proficiency among Korean laborers was quite low at this time, and which led to segregation at factories and work sites and the potential for conflict with Japanese workers. Newspapers often cited linguistic misunderstanding as a factor in violence between Korean and Japanese workers. And it also served as a convenient way to downplay legitimate grievances among Korean workers, as in reports that attributed an uprising at a local steel factory to quote unquote linguistic misunderstanding during salary negotiations. So these accounts present a kind of chilling counterpoint to the rhetoric of Naisen Yuwa, or Japan and Korea in harmony, which is to say, if linguistic exchange was framed as the linchpin of racial harmony, then the result of linguistic failure was racial violence. But even Koreans with Japanese proficiency still face scrutiny on the basis of accent patterns that could be taken as telltale signs of phonetic bias, unassimilated phonetic bias. So it was widely thought that Koreans who might be able to pass as Japanese in appearance would be unable to do so through the voice. And so the common sense currency of these views makes it hard to trace their genealogy, but one can point to works in the field of national language studies, or kokugo gaku, that address the phonetic attributes of Korean in contrast to standard kokugo pronunciation. For instance, in this 1918 study, we find the discussion of, quote, sounds that are confused by Korean speakers of Naichi Japanese or homeland Japanese, end quote, and their correspondence to pronunciation errors made by Japanese people with stammers. So this is a book about speech correction for people with stammers, but they're using a colonial study from Korea to analogize Japanese people with stammers to Korean speakers of Japanese. And so what we see here is a table of Korean mispronunciations, which highlight the, for instance, unvoicing of voice consonants. Ga becomes ka, za becomes sa, for instance, or the reversal of long for short vowel sounds. Taisol becomes taisol. The elision of the nasalized n sound, gomen kudasai becomes kome kutasai, etc. So the authors in this study note that the lack of similarly voiced consonants or voiced sounds in Korean leads to the difficulty with certain consonants. So they suggest fixing the Korean accent through a series of corrective exercises, similar to those that would be given to people with stammers or stutters. For instance, with the syllable K, one would repeat phrases like this. There's a number of them here. I'll read it. I'll read a few. Keikon, policeman. kenka wo suru na. Don't fight. Keisatsu no mae ni keijiban ni keihou ga kakagete aru. There is a warning posted on the bulletin board of the police station. So as you go through the examples, it becomes increasingly clear that there's a sense of subversive potential, let's say, coloring the sound of the Korean body, right? Even before it reaches the ears of many in the metropole, that all of these ones oriented toward Korean speakers will be about the police, essentially, sort of bears this out. And indeed, apologies, and indeed press coverage of Koreans during these years was largely negative, mainly devoted to, as we saw, accounts of crime and suspected crime involving Korean dissidents. So the futei senjin threat was a sort of peculiar sonic media in the sense that it didn't need to be heard necessarily in order to be felt. But instead, by tensing the ears of the readers with paranoid acuity, this regime of mediation, I think, invited a mode of listening that edged toward a perpetual state of surveillance when it came to Koreans, or listening after something that might happen. And this mode of paranoid listening reached its apex when the Great Kantō Earthquake struck Tokyo in September 1923. Fires broke out immediately. The eruption of gas mains, electrical explosions, and collapsing structures thundered across the city. And as night fell, these noises activated the worst fears of many residents. Rumors arose that unruly Koreans had taken to the streets to hurl bombs and wreak havoc, right? So all of that, in effect, the fear of Korean violence that had been percolating in the press over the previous several years finally erupted in the ears of the city's residents, leading many to process every suspicious sound as an index of Korean treachery, suspected, right? So, and meanwhile, the collapse of communications infrastructure meant that the source and scope of the chaos was hard to grasp with the eye. The sociologist Shimizu Ikutaro later described this as this loss of media organs as akin to a state of temporary blindness, which not only induces a fear of the unseen, but also allows that fear to mutate and form purely, as he puts it, out of one's own expectations and premonitions. So this fear is what he proposes becomes a form of news in the form of rumors, right? But just as crucially, these rumors played upon an already existing sense of visual impairment, which was the difficulty of distinguishing so-called unruly Koreans from ethnic Japanese. Many rumors suggested that futei senjin could simply change their clothes or disguise themselves in order to exploit their phenotypic likenesses in order to violate the kokumin, or the national Japanese public. So in response, methods sprung forth for trying to identify telltale markers of Koreanness, the most salient being vocal interrogation. As one article in a newspaper advised readers, quote, ask suspicious people their age according to the imperial calendar, or ask them to recite the iroha. Right? Even if they're able to keep up in Japanese, the sound of Korean will strike bluntly enough against the ears to give them away. Right? So these are the sort of the shibboleths. So in the famous poem Jugoen Gojisen, the poet Tsuboi Shigeji describes an example of his experience witnessing one of these interrogations on a train. It's sort of prose-based, so I can just read it, the relevant portion here. So he's describing his experience on a train car. A soldier armed with a saber and pistol stepped on to search the train. He stared the car up and down before pointing to a man in a livery coat squatting beside me and barked, "Say, Jugoen Gojisen." The man, failing to grasp the meaning of the soldier's bizarre demand, paused, and then impassively replied in exemplary Japanese, "Jugoen Gojisen." There's a typo there, sorry. Very well. After the soldier had holstered his weapons and moved on, I glanced to the face of the man beside me and said, "Jugoen Gojisen." I repeated the phrase to myself until its meaning dawned on me. Oh, if the man in the livery coat had been Korean and had replied with Chukoen Kochisen, he would have been surely dragged out on the spot. So the poem's title refrain translates to 15 yen and 50 cents. And at the end of this section, Tsuboi, the poet, learns that the phrase, like those textbook exercises, served as a shibboleth to test the phonetic bias of a speaker. Should they fail to voice the J and the G consonant sounds properly, they would essentially betray themselves as Korean and face certain death, perhaps, at the hands of this auditor. In this case, the man armed with the saber and pistol. Now, for Korean residents, this lynching campaign was its own sonic terror. As one account put it, the neighborhood was in an uproar, with people shouting, "Kill the futei senjin, kill the unruly Koreans." Hearing this, many Koreans knew that they would be forced to speak to perform these tests. Another said, "Hardly any of us spoke Japanese, so they would spot us right away." This was one Korean factory worker. Another mentioned, "We didn't dare speak up for fear of giving ourselves away, but one of our comrades did speak. As the vigilantes approached, he called out, 'I can't understand what they're saying, translate it for me.' Hearing this, they cut him down on the spot," end quote. So such vocal encounters threw the anxiety of colonial estrangement into relief here. In other words, in these encounters, hearing the sound of their own language rendered foreign from within, the vigilante communities, or kyodotai as they called themselves, were faced with the threat that the colonial counter represented, that being the mutual estrangement of the voice from its supposed sense of place, and their own voices made incomprehensible as a result. So in the face of this disorientation, their solution was therefore to reconstitute the boundaries of the sensible by brutally implementing this violence inherent in the harmonic system of Naisen Yua. But in the victim's reference to in the previous slide, the victim's reference to fellow comrades or nakama gives us a sense of an equally dire threat to the policing body, and that's the language of class solidarity. And indeed, it was for this reason that police spent all day September 3rd after the earthquake rounding up Japanese labor leaders under the pretense of protecting public safety, but really to settle scores with the labor movement. Once the organizers were in custody, the police killed them and disposed of their bodies along the Arakawa Canal, along with several hundred Korean and Chinese bodies. This incident, this is the Kamedo incident, this points to the ways in which a larger leftist purge that predated the earthquake was carried out in concert with the spread of these anti-Korean rumors. So what many deduced was that the post-quake rumors were not organic necessarily, but were part of a kind of surreptitious propaganda campaign or a dissemination campaign carried out by the state and the police to purge a leftist political threat. And so, for the poet Tsuboi, the source of the violence for him went without saying. He goes on in the previous poem, was it really, and he's addressing the Korean here, was it really the rubberneckers who killed you? Who was it that armed those rubberneckers with bamboo spears? Who passed them their fireman's hooks? Who made their sabers swing? I know. So in the context of what we just learned, what he appears to know would be the involvement of the police. Right? But rather than saying that, he seems to change the subject in the next line. He goes on, I know, it's because of the Japanese word zabuton, that you could not help but pronounce as safuton. Because you were made to read the rescript, but could not, it was simply for this, my Korean comrades, that you were so cruelly slain. So here, what Tsuboi knows creates an enjambment that allows him to imply what can't be said by kind of saying two things at once. Who made their sabers swing? I know. It's because of the Japanese word for zabuton. So after creating an expectation for the police to appear in the next line, right? Tsuboi inserts the Japanese word for zabuton in their place. I think kind of summoning the police as a virtual of unspoken presence in the latter. So with this kind of verbal palimpsest, he entreats the reader to see through the regime of oral sensibility housed in the word zabuton to the force of systematic violence lurking behind it. To consider, in other words, that it was both state violence and the violence of vocal harmony that drove the public or the rubberneckers to take up arms. So in the days following the earthquake, Shimizu Ikutaro recalled that the populace was reduced to, as he put it, a primordial state, implying a primarily oral state where the assurance of communal safety rested upon the power of the voice. And here we can suspect he's referring to the necessity of these rumors in the task of collective survival, thus creating a sort of natural susceptibility among the public for propaganda. There's no reliable sources for information, right? But in locating a collective self within this realm of primary orality, I think Shimizu elides the extent to which this sense of selfhood, in fact, found definition in opposition to the merely vocal or to mere vocal sound. Indeed, these voice tests showed that the most prevalent form of self-defense relied on separating the bare utterance, or we can say phone, from the bare utterance phone of the colonized from the meaningful speech or logos of the national language, right? So more than just a byproduct of confusion, the performances of these phonetic voice tests, I think, stage a kind of vulgar reenactment of the origin of political community from a state of bare life, and I'm sort of borrowing from Agamben here, from a state of bare life to political life, from Zoe to bios, which sort of corresponds, right, to phone and logos. So where the primal scene of this racial ascription through the voice ultimately serves to draw the sensory boundaries that delimit the us from them of the public order. But it's crucial to note here that these voice tests were unreliable, right? Wildly unreliable. In fact, the same newspaper that outlined methods for vocal interrogation also warned its readers that Koreans, quote, were not the only ones in danger, end quote. For those who spoke in Tohoku dialect, for instance, the paper said, quote, their stammering accent might raise suspicions, end quote. So in order to avoid being mistaken for a Korean, those with regional accents would have to police themselves as much as their own surroundings. And indeed, many misidentifications had already occurred in the days following the earthquake. By the time articles started to come out about this, police and vigilantes had not only killed thousands of Korean and Chinese residents, but in the process, an uncertain number of Japanese provincial migrants who had been misheard as colonial dissidents. So on the surface, these instances of failed interpolation would seem to discredit any notion that the voice could serve as a reliable stamp of racial identity. I'm wrapping up here, sorry for going over. Yet paradoxically, I suggest that they revealed the perceived need for the fiction of voice recognition to be maintained and the violence required to maintain it. So in other words, to conclude, insofar as the national self was not self-evident, right, such evidence had to be manufactured through the sonic emphatic contours of the voice. That is, in order to reconstitute the colonial social order from a moment of identity crisis, where its inherent contingency and contradictions are laid bare, the social order had to be performed into being. And if the theater of this performance was the street, I think the medium was the voice, that vanishing medium par excellence, whose contingent nature was, like national identity, readily veiled by the common sense notion of its supposed inherence. And so out of this catastrophic ferment and for ruthlessly political ends, a voice of the people took on a coherent form. Thank you.